Vanakkam. Welcome to this video on biomechanics. So, we are interested in studying the biomechanical analysis of joints of the upper limb. So, when we say joints of the upper limb, what exactly do we mean? So, we are interested in shoulder joint, elbow joint, wrist joint and all the joints of the fingers. So, in this video, we will be looking at what are the joints of the upper limb, what are the muscles that are present in the upper limb, shoulder joints and the muscles that span the shoulder joint and movements that happen in the shoulder joint. So, we will introduce to the broad topic and then we will focus more on shoulder joint in this video. So, when we say joints of the upper limb, primarily what comes to our mind are three joints: shoulder joint, elbow joint, wrist joint. There are other joints. For example, all these joints that I am now flexing and moving, these are all the various joints that we are doing, right? All these, some of the joints are flexed, some of the joints are extended, and then I also have the thumb, many joints. So, all these joints within the hand, so I call that part of the arm that is distal to the wrist joint as hand. All the joints in the hand I am calling as hand and finger joints. That's a lot of joints, but I have to classify somehow. We have to have a working definition. So, I am going to call all these as hand and finger joints, and we will look at the hand and finger joints in a future video. Because once you remove this, a lot of complexity is immediately removed, because it turns out that the hand is one of the most articulated organs within the human body, which is why it is having so much dexterity. Much of the civilization as we know it today was perhaps built with the dexterity of the human hand. Imagine a world in which you do not have this much dexterity. We might still be crawling on trees, jumping from tree to tree, just saying. So, going back, we are interested in the joints of the upper limb. Immediately there are three major joints: the shoulder joint, this joint, right, the elbow joint and the wrist joint. These are the three joints of interest. Although we call this as shoulder joint, shoulder is not a single point, right? This whole area, in general, in English, we call this as shoulder. Yet, when it is shoulder joint, I am talking about this joint. If this is the shoulder, there must be other joints that come into the picture, and they do. Likewise for the elbow, likewise for the wrist. So, let us look at this step by step. Also, when we are discussing muscles, right, muscles that span the shoulder joint, these muscles, and then muscles that span the elbow joint are the muscles of the forearm, and then muscles that supply the hand itself, right. So, muscles of the shoulder joint, muscles of the forearm, the anterior side or the side that is facing front, the posterior side, the side that is facing the back, and then muscles of the hand. When you say muscles of the hand, muscles that are supplying the hand, maybe their muscle bellies are located in the forearm, and then muscles that are located within the hand. So, there are two major types of muscles when we discuss muscles of the hand. We will look at all these in future videos maybe. Coming back to the shoulder joint, actually it is not a single joint that is present in the shoulder. There are multiple joints. First is the sternoclavicular joint, right. This is the joint between the clavicle and manubrium of the sternum, located here on the axial skeleton, close to the axial skeleton, right. This connects the upper limb to the axial skeleton, right. This is a saddle joint, it is a synovial joint. So, there is a synovial fluid and this is a saddle joint. Remember, in one of our early introduction of the types of joints, we discussed a saddle joint. Remember, this is how the joint will look like. So, there can be movement like this and movement like this. There are, it is like a saddle. There are two movements that are possible. It is a saddle joint. Then you have acromioclavicular joint. This is where the acromion process of the scapula, this is one of the big bones located on the back side or on the posterior side, the acromion process of the scapula and the lateral clavicle, lateral means towards the side, medial clavicle is meeting the sternum here, right. So, this is the sternoclavicular joint, where the lateral clavicle meets the posterior bone, which is the scapula. So, that means this bone is not running like this horizontally, rather it is inclined. When I am looking from the top, you are going to see not a line like this, but rather inclined. It is running from the front to the back like that. Okay, that is the clavicle. Right. This is a plain joint or a gliding joint. Then you have the scapulothoracic joints. Scapula is this bone that is located in the back, and this is this articulation between the posterior rib cage. Posterior rib cage means the rib cage is this set of bones that are present to protect some very important organs. What are these? The heart and the lungs, of course. So, the heart and the lungs are protected by this bony structure, right, the rib cage. The back side of the rib cage, which is why it is called posterior rib cage. The posterior rib cage and the front side of the scapula bone itself, there is an articulation. This articulation is called scapulothoracic joint, except because there might be many, right, because there are many in the rib cage, there are many small bones, right. So, there are many such joints per se, but technically this is not a joint in the technical sense, because it does not show any of the joint characteristics in terms of movements and this. So, but there is this articulation that exists. Okay. Then you have the glenohumeral joint. This is the where the glenoid fossa of the scapula and the head of the humerus. Humerus is this bone and glenoid fossa of the scapula is here. These two attach. In general, when people in biomechanics field say shoulder joint, they are referring to this joint, right. So, in this course, for the rest of this course, whenever I say shoulder joint, it refers to the glenohumeral joint. Okay. It is a very movable joint, it is a highly movable joint, and it has and we have already spoken about this, that it is a ball and socket type joint. Right. Ball and socket type joint means it, so suppose this is the socket and this is the ball, it can actually rotate in many different directions. So, which is why you see that I can perform this movement, right. I can perform that movement, I can perform that movement, abduction, adduction, this is flexion, extension. I can perform a combination of these, right. Very complicated movements can be performed by this, very movable joint. Normally, this ball of the humerus is almost always located within the socket. In some relatively pathological conditions, you have this dislocation. It's an extremely painful process, in which sometimes for some specific set of people it is still unclear why this is happening. Some specific set of people seem to have frequent dislocation of the shoulders, and when that happens, they will have to they will have to take urgent orthopedic help, right. But normally most normal people can perform this humongous huge range of movements that is offered by this shoulder joint. So, we will focus on this joint, the glenohumeral joint, and the muscles that span the glenohumeral joint and the muscles that are responsible for the movements of the glenohumeral joint. Going forward, I will be referring the glenohumeral joint as the shoulder joint. Remember this, every time I say shoulder joint, I am meaning the glenohumeral joint. Okay. What are the muscles that span this joint? There are actually many muscles. One is the deltoid muscle, the other is the trapezius muscle, the third one is the muscle in the chest called as the pectoralis major. Then some muscles, small muscles, subclavius muscle, and then there is the muscle that is responsible for the movement of the head, this is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Deltoid, this is a muscle that is having many heads, that is why origins are given at many points, anterior border and superior surface of the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. So, somewhere here, lateral 1/3 of the clavicle, okay, is where, and there is also, so remember it is still not clear whether the muscle is a functional unit or a structural unit. Is it an anatomical classification or is it a physiological classification? So, we continue to use terminology that has been given to us. So, that means that many times there might be different heads of the same muscle that might originate at different points, and we might call the whole thing as a single muscle because this is anatomy for you. Please hang on with me as we discuss some technical terms. Okay. So, the other part is originating on the acromial lateral margin. Then you have some parts that originate at the lower edge of the crest of the scapular spine. Right. They all insert on the humerus, of course, and now it makes sense. Before this, okay, they are starting at multiple points here, fine. They are all attaching to the deltoid tuberosity on the lateral surface of the shafts of the humerus here. They all attach, they span the joint and then they attach. Right. What is the purpose? What does it do? What does this muscle do? Flexion, adduction, adduction, and medial rotation of the shoulder joint, many different things. So, it can do flexion and adduction. Right. Remember, when the shoulder goes like this, it is abduction, this is adduction. And for the whole arm, it might appear as if it is doing extension, adduction and lateral rotation of the arm done by the other heads. Then you have the trapezius muscle. This is a relatively large muscle that starts at the skull, at the base of the skull, right, occipital bone, medial 1/3 of the superior nuchal line of the occipital bone, somewhere here it starts, right. And it inserts into the upper posterior border of lateral 1/3 of the clavicle, here upper posterior border of the lateral 1/3. So, you will have to use all three dimensions, upper, posterior on the back side and lateral means on the side. Here. Remember, this clavicle is a bone that goes like this. Right. Its purpose is to rotate scapula. Although our interest is shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint, it still makes sense for us to understand all the muscles. So, I know immediately, hey, but this is not attaching to the humerus. Yes, this is not, but these movements will also eventually influence or indirectly or sometimes directly influence the movements within the shoulder joint. So, it is useful to keep this in our armor. We may not use it, we may not need it, but we must it makes sense for us to still understand how this works, right. And the other heads, start below the head in the spinal cord, in the region of the spinal cord, spinous process and supraspinous ligaments of T1, T2, T1 to T12 somewhere. So, it is a long, relatively large muscle, right. So, they have this job of rotating the scapula, elevating the scapula, retracting the scapula, all these things, right. Then you have the chest muscle, the big muscle in the chest, these muscles, the pectoralis major, right. So, this partly contributes to the medial rotation and adduction of shoulder joint, right. It is so different heads are there. So, there is a clavicular head, there is a sternocostal head, and they all attach to this, they all attach to the humerus at different locations. So, we will focus for example on the clavicular head. It is originating on the medial half of the anterior surface of the clavicle, right. Medial half means that half that is closer to the middle line, the medial half of the anterior surface. Anterior means towards the front. By the way, this is something that I will require all the students to remember, what anterior posterior means, what medial lateral means, right, what superior inferior means, and so on. We have spent some time discussing the directional terms, because there is going to be quite a bit of this kind of language. Medial half of the anterior surface of the clavicle is somewhere here, is it not? This is a major origin. Remember, this is a convergent muscle. So, you will have a very small starting point and then the muscle broadens out, right. It is a convergent muscle, something that you can see. And this is responsible for medial rotation and adduction of the shoulder joint. Then you have this subclavius muscle. This is originating in the first rib, and it is cartilage associated with the first rib. Its insertion is on the clavicle itself. So, there are many attachments that happen at the clavicle, it seems. Yes, there are many origins and insertions that happen on this bone, very important bone, this one, right. Its job, trivial as it might seem, is steadying the clavicle, making sure that the clavicle itself does not move because of the other muscle actions, steadying it. This is a function. Then the sternocleidomastoid muscle, this, the origin is the medial sternal or upper anterior surface of the manubrium sterni. So, somewhere here, and the insertion is on the side of the mastoid process here, right, lateral side of the mastoid process here, by a thin aponeurosis to lateral half of the superior nuchal line, somewhere here, this, right. Its job is to tilt the head like this, or this muscle tilts the head like this, and this muscle tilts the head like this. Trivial as it might seem, this is an important function. Sometimes children are born with one of these two muscles. There are two muscles on the two sides of the body. One of these two muscles is just a tad bit stronger than the other muscle. then what happens? When this happens at birth, what happens is that the child keeps the head tilted like this. Because the head is always tilted like this, the child has a tendency to sleep on one side of the head, leading to asymmetrical shape of the head, the whole head itself. A lot of problems happen because of this very small muscle and a very small problem in this muscle. So, many things will have to work properly for what is considered normal function, something that healthy people take for granted, okay, something to keep in mind. So, the function is to tilt the head towards the ipsilateral shoulder. What is ipsilateral shoulder? Ipsi means on the same, lateral means side, ipsilateral means tilting the head to the same side. You must be able to tilt. Actually, older people cannot tilt as much, but people who are younger must be in a position to tilt the head that much that the ear touches the shoulder, like that. I am now touching the ear with the shoulder by raising the shoulder, that is not fair. Children and young adults must be in a position to tilt the head so that the ear touches the shoulder. The head should touch the shoulder should not be raised. Many times when children who have this problem are asked to touch the shoulder with the ears, they will raise the shoulder because that is the compensatory movement. Remember this. So, what are the movements of the sternoclavicular joint and acromioclavicular joint? Right. Elevation and depression of the shoulder, sternoclavicular joint, elevation and depression of the shoulder like this, and protraction and retraction of the shoulder, doing that, right, retraction and protraction of the shoulder. These are not very articulated movements that is normally discussed, but since we are discussing the shoulder joint, it makes sense for us to be complete about this. Then for the acromioclavicular movements, rotation of the shoulder, the whole shoulder, not just this rotation, this is supination, pronation, we will discuss that in future, this whole arm rotation, right. Again, not a very articulated movement, not discussed in much detail. Of course, we will restrict our attention to movements in the glenohumeral joint. In the glenohumeral joint, of course, I can do flexion, I can do extension, I can do that, I can do that. So, that is flexion, extension. Remember, these are movements in the sagittal plane. We did discuss this when we discussed movements of the sagittal plane, right. So, flexion, extension, right, and abduction, adduction. So, abduction, adduction, and then I can also do circumduction, right, I can do that. These movements are happening in the frontal plane, right, or in the coronal plane. So, with this we come to the end of this video. In this video, we discussed what are the various joints in the upper limb, the muscles that are there in the upper limb. We focused our attention on the shoulder joint and muscles of the shoulder joint and movements that happen in the shoulder joint. Thank you very much for your attention.